After you've brought data into PowerPivot for Excel 2013, you can summarize that data in a pivot table. To demonstrate the process, I will use the Create Pivot sample file, which you can find in the Chapter 9 folder of your exercise files archive. To create a pivot table in PowerPivot, you need to open up PowerPivot. So I'll click the PowerPivot tab on the ribbon, and then click Manage. My PowerPivot data model contains two tables. You can see their names here, sales summary and month names. So what I want to do is to summarize all of that data in a pivot table. One benefit of working in PowerPivot is that I have created a relationship between the sales summary and month name tables. And if I click the Design tab on the ribbon and click Manage Relationships, you can see in the dialog box that there is a relationship between the month field of the sales summary table and the month ID field of the month names table. That'll come in handy when I show you how to work with the pivot table inside of PowerPivot. So I'll click Close to close the dialog box, and then on the Home tab of the PowerPivot ribbon, I'll click the Pivot Table button. Doing so displays the Insert Pivot dialog box, and I want to create my pivot table on a new worksheet, so I'll leave that option selected and click OK. When the pivot table appears, you can see a blank pivot table here on a new worksheet, which in my workbook is named Sheet 4. It might be named something different in yours. And you'll also see over in the Pivot Table Fields pane that there are two tables instead of just one, or rather a list of fields like you would see in a single table if you created a pivot table inside of the regular Excel program. When you create the file, you'll see the Files area show month names and Table 1. Table name is the name of the table in the original Excel file from which the values are derived, and that's why that name appears there. So here we have month names, which if I click it, you can see that there's month ID and month name. And there's also a second table named Sales Summary, which has order ID, date, year, and so on. And those table names and lists of fields reflect the two source data tables that I used from PowerPivot to create this pivot table. Now I can add fields to the body of the pivot table to display and manipulate its data. So I'll add department to the columns area, and then I'll scroll down and add total to the values area. Doing so displays sales totals for the 5 different departments. If you want to format this field, you can do so using the techniques that I've shown you elsewhere in the course. But now let me show you what happens if I add the month field from the sales summary table to the rows area. Doing so displays all of the months that have sales, and those are months 1, 2, 3, and 11 and 12, January, February, March, and November and December. But let's say that I want to display the month names instead of the month numbers. I can do that by dragging month back to the fields area to remove it from the pivot table. And then I'll scroll up, and from the month names table, I'll drag the month name field to the rows area. Doing so displays the months, but you'll notice that instead of being in chronological order, the months are in alphabetical order. To fix that, I need to sort the data inside of that field. So I'll hover the mouse pointer over the month name field over in the pivot table fields pane, click the downward pointing black triangle that appears, and click Sort A to Z. Now, because month names are a known custom list inside of Excel, when I click Sort A to Z, instead of staying in alphabetical order like they are now, the months are sorted January, February, March, November, and December into the known order. And once you have your data inside of your PowerPivot pivot table, you can work with it just as you would any normal pivot table. If your data collection is less than a few thousand rows, then you probably won't need to use PowerPivot. But if your data collection is quite large, perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions of rows, then the technique that I showed you allows you to create a pivot table that you can manipulate using the skills that you've learned elsewhere in this course.